There's also a bit of drama there in terms of her marriage and the fact that she's searching for her missing husband, and that's the thread that draws you through the story. And across this forested landscape, will she or will she not find her husband, and what will happen in the end? The other character, though, was a bit of a surprise to me. I wanted two female leads, really, and I invented a character who's a sort of character I liked. I like to read about in other novels, a character who's also an author. And Star is a cub reporter of the local newspaper in New Warwick, the New Warwick Beacon. This is like a 19th century sort of version of a newspaper. You know, they've discovered an old linotype press, you know, and they're churning out. It's just like they're trying to recreate the society we live in. So Star is a cub reporter, and she was going to be a minor character, but as other writers will tell you, sometimes these characters, although you think you've got them under control, they begin to become more and more important. And as I was writing her in, I realised she was going to carry a journal around with her so she could write a book when she got back after this epic journey with Lara. So she's basically rather skinny, early 20s, feisty, but also quite vulnerable in some ways, young woman who was brought up in an orphanage. She's another, one of these people that's in a recovering society, never known parents, very, very courageous, and I'm hoping if I ever get round to writing a sequel, if anybody wants a sequel, that Star will star in that. And I hope you do enjoy reading about those two characters. There are men in the book, by the way, as well. So I realised that I should have said that. And there's, of course, there's an arch villain, but it's the two women who drive the story. And I very much enjoyed writing a book from a woman's point of view. And I don't know whether I've succeeded, but it would be nice to get some feedback one day if you want to give it to me.
Ken did admit that Star's his favourite character to me recently, and I can see why. She's one of those charmingly bonkers women that you come across from time to time that you shouldn't mess with, and various parts in the book you need to have someone like that. She's afraid of nothing, and she'll have a go at anything, and it helps to drive the story, and I wouldn't want to get in her way. Although she's small and she's young, she knows exactly what she's doing because she just doesn't care. It's brilliant, fantastic. So if you do want to do a sequel, feel free, as far as I'm concerned. We've just come into the end, and I want to be honest of just chatting you. Just to finish off, I've been very careful not to give away the ending. I've gotten terrible at things like that. I can't keep a secret to save my life, so I've been trying to keep that under wraps. But I just wanted you to say a little bit more, if you wouldn't mind, about the idea of there is some hope at the end. It's not one of those books that's going to leave you feeling flat or anything like that. But you read an adventure, you read a love story, and at the end you read something about what could still happen if we don't look at what we're doing carefully and take things a bit steadier and just genuinely think about what our actions can, what impact our actions can have on us now, and more importantly probably for those of our children and grandchildren in the future. So if you just finish off on that point, and then we'll take questions.
Yeah, sure. Well, very briefly, when I talked about the new Middle Ages, I was trying to draw a parallel with where we are now rather than in the future. And there's, I think, some striking and interesting and perhaps worrying trends in our world now. The decline of literacy is one. And in the world I've sketched, education is quite hard to come by, at least extended education. And also the reliance today on more and more visual images for communication, icons rather than words. I saw a nice cartoon the other day which showed a job interview, and the interviewer was saying to the applicant, I thought you were bilingual, and he said, yes, English and emoji. And there's a serious point in that cartoon as well about that. The other trend which I've read quite a few people who are concerned about the internet and its impact through social media and other ways, in terms of the parochialization of society, in terms of the fact that we increasingly look for people who are like us when we're making friends on Facebook or using social media. So we're clustering more and more into these artificial worlds of like-minded people we think we like. And our fear of those who aren't like us grows. I think it's quite striking in a society where the crime rate is plummeting that we're more and more afraid of violence and crime because we're clustering into these rather limited, static worlds. The other, just quickly, one other trend is the lack of social mobility in today's world. The growth of inequality is one thing. There's always been inequality. I mean, if you think about the Victorian age, there were huge social gaps. But there was also a lot of social mobility. Any Dickens novel will show you people who are whizzing up to the top and people who are sinking down into poverty. Now we're getting into a new Middle Ages where we have these static, semi-feudal groups. And also a kind of government which we're losing touch with, and a ruling clique which seems to perpetuate itself. Politicians have become a self-recruiting group. And we're faced with, in a sense, a decline of democracy, the old idea of the rational citizen. I mean, it was always a bit of an ideal, but are we moving towards being inhabitants of a very coercive society, gently coercive and persuasive sometimes, but sometimes not? So when you read about the result of the Civil War in Prophecy of Ravens, and the ravens, by the way, are linked to the monarchy and the Tower of London. I won't say any more than that. And you have the restoration of the monarchy. You also have the restoration of this static world. But there is a glimmer of hope, because Star provides that. She's the cub reporter. She stands for literacy, enlightenment, and progress. And it's her you'll have to watch for the future. So that's all I need to say there.
Thanks, Ken. Thank you. This is the bit where everybody looks at their shoes, but this is your opportunity. We've got some time. If you'd like to ask Ken a question about Prophecy of Ravens, I'm sure he'd be delighted, and I'm sure there'd be better questions that I managed to come up with. So if you'd like to, please. I'd like to have a man with a mic like they do in Hay, but we can't run to that, I'm afraid. It's a lady over there. There's a question over there.
Yeah.
And also the image of
well, Tim, my great publisher, will have to explain about the image. But the ravens refer to the ravens in the Tower of London, and there is actually a keeper of ravens. The ravens do leave the Tower of London because London sinks under water when the Thames barrage breaks down. So, but some ravens are kept, and they're the symbol that's important for the future. And there is one raven in particular at the very end that says something, actually. And the word prophecy is obviously, because we're talking about a future story. Incidentally, originally I had a working title of The Hour of the Raven, but I had difficulty with my then publisher, who kept stalling on publication. So it almost became, in the end, I thought, well, should we call it The Decade of the Raven? And then when we, eventually The Century of the Raven. So I thought, no, I better give up on this and call it Prophecy of the Raven.
Anyone else like to ask a question?
Apart from Laura Johnson, how did the legal system work? Was it in effect, or is it an effective legal system in this?
Yeah, it's solely restricted to the city-state.
Yeah.
So there is a greater England, and that is subdivided into different regions, like in this case South Mercia would be the city-state in which Warwick exists. But the city-state has its own laws. It's a bit like devolution gone crazy, because now we're talking, aren't we, about Wales getting more powers and devolution. And individual cities, certainly in England, like Manchester, will be getting more and more powers of their own. So the legal system is like that. I'm imagining a place where there are perhaps a handful of judges. And Lara is an appeals court judge, and she hears the appeal of the two Welshmen at the beginning of the story.
Anyone else? Ken's not rushing off, and it's time to mingle, and we've got music and things to come.
I'd like to ask a question. The premise of the book, obviously, it's a good 60 years from now, and there's been a lot of pandemics, and you stumbled on that as what's the cause and effect, basically. But I think it was last week, Panorama was on about the antibiotic apocalypse and all these kind of breakdowns in disease and things like that. So it's almost like the book is meeting real life head on.
Yes.
Were you aware of that when you wrote it, or was that just used as a plot device?
Yes. I'm sorry, I don't know if you caught that. No. But
Talking wall.
Made a foghorn.
Tim, actually I should have mentioned this earlier, that the story is set after a pandemic, and in fact Tim asked me at the beginning of looking at this book, how realistic is this, that millions of people will die from plagues, another parallel with the Middle Ages. And actually I said, well, probably not that many, we might lose a few million, but we wouldn't end up with a tiny population. But having, studied the area a bit and talked to people a friend of mine, for example, is an environmental scientist, and told me that the government actually has 3 disaster scenarios in mind. One of them is a pandemic on a large scale. And there is apparently the Home Office has a whole, a whole system set up for us to have flu buddies. So in the early days of a crisis, there'll be public announcements about, pick someone who you will be able to rely on in case, you can't get out or you need food or whatever. And the reason for this is not just simply because of new hybrid diseases like bird flu, but the fact that these viruses are being experimented on in labs, particularly in America, where they are deliberately crossing, for example, bird flu with swine flu and other types of diseases like Ebola, to make them the most lethal viruses ever, to discover how they could knock those on the head, which is a rational scientific process. But unfortunately not every laboratory is 100% safe. There have already been at least 6 escapes of viruses from these laboratories in the States. And as Tim said, there was a Panorama TV program a week or so back, which was, I think, titled Antibiotic Apocalypse. Because the decline of the potency of antibiotics is also going to happen. That they, of course, won't affect viruses, but if you think of the two things coming together, it's not that unfeasible. But again, I'm not really necessarily that bothered about how realistic the story is, but I'm trying to talk about our present-day society and the fact that we are moving towards a new Middle Ages where we're worried about plagues. We used to live in a world where we thought medicine would conquer everything gradually, and we'd live in a more or less disease-free world. And people in white coats would look after us, nicely. But we're now realizing the limitations of medicine. We're realizing the limitations of our economy, and the fact that people won't necessarily, sons and daughters, grandchildren today, won't be able to afford to buy a house. They won't necessarily have a higher standard of living than we do. So all sorts of things are closing in, and I think that was to go hand in hand with the idea of a pandemic too. But I didn't want to end on such a dismal note.
It's a cheerful note, sleep easy.
Hold us some more wine.
I should ask the question again.
But actually, there's nothing nicer than a bit of gloom to make you feel happy in the end.
You're in the right place to cheer yourselves up anyway.
Thanks very
So,
much.
finish?
Yep.
Right, and just congratulate our friend Ken here on his little explanation of his book. I can recommend it highly. Thank you very much.